is Freedom 1110, WKQA Norfolk, serving Eastern Virginia and North Carolina with 50,000 watts of power and worldwide at WKQARadio.com. It's time for the Nora Firestone Show on Freedom 1110 WKQA. You're invited to be a part of the program by calling 757-222-3705. That's 757-222-3705.
Good afternoon, Hampton Roads, and good afternoon to whoever will hear this broadcast and also see its recording on YouTube. And I am simulcasting this broadcast with a recording so I can put it on YouTube, and therefore it'll be available to you if you didn't catch a chance to hear the show live. My name is Drew Nickell. I'm sitting in for Nora Firestone on the Nora Firestone Show. Nora's off doing another project today, and she asked me to guest host for her, so that's what I'm doing. And it looks like a very typically dreary, wet day here in Eastern Virginia. It's just, we've had so much rain this year that I thought about the wisdom of refinancing my house, and I'm trying to figure out, should I just get a boat instead, because my house is going to end up floating anyway, but that's beside the point, and perhaps a little exaggeration, but it's the wettest winter I can remember in these parts. And a lot of you to the north and west of us have gotten a lot of snow this year. We have gotten nary a trace of snow here in Hampton Roads, but it has been a lot of rain. So looking forward to the arrival of spring, warmer temperatures, and a chance to get outside and do some of the things that the rainy and cool and damp weather has kept us in for the season. So it's a day after St. Patrick's Day, and March 18th. We arrive at spring later this weekend actually, and looking forward to everything that entails. So let's take a look at where we are in a sense of our overall psyches, if you were. A lot of us are experiencing now the effects of COVID in ways that the powers that be perhaps did not intend. My granddaughter, who is in Washington State, is well into the second year of not having any school. Her second grade year has basically been obliterated, except for the fact that she has had home-based learning, but it just doesn't equal going to school and all of the attendant benefits of school. I was always a kind of an advocate of moving towards a remote learning model, but I didn't think about the effects that this would have on children not being in physical proximity to one another. You think about, for instance, your own school days, and if you think back, you might remember your favorite teachers or your favorite friends, or perhaps your favorite nemesis, as they were, because we all had kids we didn't get along with, and perhaps we remember those too. But all of that, the good, the bad, the pretty, the ugly, is negated when we keep our kids locked up at home with only access to a computer image of perhaps a teacher and a lesson, but there's no one watching the child to see if the child is learning, responding, interested, or shutting down. I know myself, when I was in school, there were days when I would just basically mentally shut down, and it took the discipline of a teacher to say, hey, pay attention. Maybe they would call on me when they knew I wasn't paying attention, or something along this line. But all of that is out the window when kids aren't even in the same room. And it's a crying shame that kids would be back at school, save for the mixed messaging that we're getting on the communicability of COVID and the lack of a consensus amongst education professionals that the children are better served if they're in the classroom. And we can think of this in terms of what is going to happen to these children of this generation. How will this impact them in the long term? For instance, my granddaughter, as I said, is in Washington State, and she's been effectively out of her school since March of last year. And so from March to June, no school. And then this entire school year thus far, no school. And her school system was scheduled to open March 2nd, but then that got canceled because the teachers union in her county decided, nope, they don't want to open up school. And there's no guarantee that school will open in September of next year. Now let's just assume the worst and say for school districts in this country that aren't opening their schools next September, that will be the third school year impacted by this virus. And I should say impacted by the response to this virus, because as we know, the virus is very fatal to people who are older, have comorbidities, have other issues with their their medical history that would make them more vulnerable to death from COVID. But this has not been even insinuated that this would affect school-age children. The younger, the more so. For whatever reason, children have a resistance to certain types of viruses that people who are older or people who have comorbidities don't have. And yet, our public policy is such that there are places in this country where school teachers have been inoculated, in other words, given this vaccination to prevent COVID, and yet they're still refusing to go back to school. Now, we'd like to believe that these teachers are reticent about going back to school because of concerns for their health or things like this. I don't believe that's the case. I think that's what's happening here by virtue of the fact that the ones making the noise, so to speak, are teachers' unions. I think these teachers' unions have figured out they can get paid without having to go to work. And anybody who thinks it's just as hard to be a teacher remotely as a teacher in the classroom is not thinking straight, because let's face it, it's a lot easier to be online in a Zoom presentation and trick yourself into believing that you're providing education to children, but if there's nothing to make sure those children are paying attention, they're wasting their time. So the teachers' unions are going to have to decide, is it better to hold on your political power by holding our children hostage, or is it better to earn an honest living by virtue of the education you have received and the tools you have learned in order to provide our children with what they need, a fundamental understanding of the basics in their schooling? And that kind of takes us into another topic, if you will, because it's not only a problem of whether or not the schools are open, but whether or not the teaching being provided to our children is based on fact or based on supposition. And let me explain. There is a trend in this country that's been building over 5 decades that has placed a political agenda in the schooling of our children, where children these days are not being instructed, they're being indoctrinated. In other words, it's not enough anymore to have our children learn how to think critically, but nowadays there is an effort to make sure children think correctly. And what do I mean by that? In other words, when I was coming along in school, the idea was present school children with different viewpoints and have them arrive upon a well, for lack of a better word, a decision on what is the truth based on hearing different viewpoints. Because when you hear different viewpoints and you're exposed to different ideas from different perspectives, the idea is you're going to arrive upon what you believe to be your truth. And that's the benefit of critical education. The problem is when you front load that critical education with preconceived ideas on what is truth and what is false and what is wrong and what is right, if you go into a classroom environment with preconceived notions on the absolute truth, unless you're teaching in empirical science or mathematics, there is no such thing as an empirical truth. Let me explain. Let's say you're learning science and you're learning the basics of the science discipline, whether that's chemistry, biology, whether it's geology, whether it's physical sciences. There are absolute rights and wrongs in those disciplines. But where that absolute right and wrong has its place in the empirical sciences and in mathematics, it has no place in literature or in social studies. Because as we all know from own experiences, 5 people can witness the most mundane fender bender. 2 cars collide. And those 5 people who witness this will have different interpretations of what they've witnessed. Hence, if something that mundane and that relatively trivial, a fender bender, can be attested to in 5 different ways by people who swear their version of what happened is the correct one, then what about more complex things that we see in the news, that we read in history, that we study in the course of learning those non-scientific disciplines? You know, math isn't the answer to everything. If it was, we wouldn't have poetry. And science, empirical science, isn't the answer to everything. Because otherwise, we wouldn't have art. The point I'm trying to make is this. When we go to school, primary, elementary, middle school, high school, and post-high school studies, what should be happening is we should be exposed to different ideas so we can find that truth that we all seek. But when you say you're not going to learn this or you're not going to learn that and you're not going to be exposed to that, then what do we have? We have a limited education. We have a bifurcated education, if you will. We have a stymied education. I'm going to expound on this. There is a movement in academia that has crept into our own public school classrooms and our own parochial school classrooms in certain aspects that's based on critical race theory. Now, this is a difficult concept to understand, but the basis of critical race theory is this. Number one, Caucasian white people are perpetually trying to preserve their supremacy. This is what critical race theory indicates. That white people not only are trying to perpetually keep their privilege, so to speak, their supremacy, but they've designed this country's government, the United States government, around that aegis, that people of color will always be held down, and that people who are white must go out of their way to make sure they don't harbor prejudice in their own hearts. Now think about this. Critical race theory demands that every problem in the world is based on the inherent white racism that they say exists in this country. Their presupposition is that people of color are incapable of being racist because they are the victims of systemic racism. This is what they would have you believe. Now, those of us of a certain age remember when this country was dominated by whites only, dominated by men only. When I was a little boy, there was a struggle for civil rights, particularly in the South, and I remember seeing the dogs and the fire hoses on television. There's no debate about what occurred then. But in the 62 years I've been alive, I've seen a wholesale change in attitudes towards race and towards what's acceptable in society. And anyone who thinks that racism is just as much of a problem today as it was 60 years ago doesn't know what they're talking about at all. We have come 180 degrees from that society where we were separated. But it seems like we're headed back there because of the fact that we are being pushed back apart again. And it's happening in our highest education systems. For instance, Columbia University, a well-known Ivy League university based in New York City. They are going to have 6 separate graduation ceremonies based upon the ethnicity and the sexual orientation of their graduates, so that African American students will have their own graduation ceremony, and lesbian, gay, transgender students will have their own. In other words, forced separation, segregation, if you will. Now, if that is what is being advocated today at our highest universities, it isn't a stretch to think that this will find its way into our children's education. Today, much of this learning that's taking place based on critical race theory is designed to make white students feel bad about themselves based on things that happened well before they were even thought in their parents' mind. There is a movement, a serious movement, to provide reparations for people of color, and it's basically black people, based upon the history of segregation and slavery in this country. Now, the last man who lived under slavery as a slave was Sylvester McGee. He died in 1973. That's 48 years ago. There is no person in this country that experienced black slavery in the United States that's alive today. So, how do we go about what liberals or leftists want to do to make amends for that? They want to take money and allocate it towards only people whose ancestors might have been slaves. In other words, say my ancestors on my mother's side, they came from Italy in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Obviously, they didn't own any slaves. Barack Obama's black father was Nigerian. Nobody in his ancestry on his father's side experienced slavery in the United States, and actually ancestors of his mother were slaveholders. So in that scenario, does Obama write a check for reparations based on his white mother's history? Or does he get a check based on the fact that he is part African American, even though his father came from Nigeria? Where does this leave us? How do you determine who is benefiting from this and who is hit by it? And if you're going to allocate benefits based on racial identity, then how in the world can you say that in the future there won't be a tax based on racial identity? In other words, what's to keep this country from implementing a white tax? If certain benefits can only be allocated to people of color, like for instance, that's in this last $1.9 trillion stimulus bill, where only farmers of color get debt forgiveness for the loans they've made from the agriculture department, but white people don't qualify for that debt forgiveness. In fact, the way the bill's written, people of color, Hispanics, Africans, Asians, who have made loans from the agricultural department, which is everyday course of business, to keep their farms liquid and to keep their farms and their finances set straight, because farming is by definition a seasonal enterprise. The people who have borrowed money in order to keep their farms afloat will have that debt forgiven, but only if they are non-white. In fact, not only will they have the debt forgiven, they'll get a 20% premium on that debt come back to them in a rebate. Let me explain how this works. Let's say you are a farmer of color and you have borrowed $100,000 from the agricultural department in a loan, and with the debt forgiveness, that loan is not only wiped out, but you get 20% back in the term of a rebate. In other words, it's 120% debt forgiveness, which means not only do you have to pay back the $100,000, you don't, but you'll get another $20,000 just because of your color. Now, there's 7 ways from Sunday that this violates the 14th Amendment, equal protection under law. You can't base it on racial identity, but the Democrats are doing just that. And every single Democrat in the Senate and every single Democrat in the House of Representatives, including our own Elaine Luria, have basically voted for a package whose rewards are going to be based solely on race. Now, that's not the colorblind society I know. That's not the colorblind society Martin Luther King advocated. What that is a return to the days of segregation, only it's turned around. And leftists have no problem exacting revenge on white people today for what occurred decades and even centuries ago. So where is the equality in that? And the answer is there is no equality in that, and they don't care. They don't want equality. What they want is what they perceive to be equity. What's the difference? Equity and equality have no bearing to each other. Equality means that everybody has the same opportunity, everybody has the same laws apply to them, everybody has the same chances of success or failure, regardless of their race, their religion, their sexual orientation, their creed, whatever criteria you want to come up with. That's equality. Equity is making everything even. In other words, in true equity, a man who stands 5 feet tall should have the same opportunity, well, the same guaranteed outcome on a basketball team as a man who stands 6'9" tall, which is preposterous. There is no way you're ever going to have a basketball player disadvantaged because they are taller than their opponent. Well, in the idea of equity, you adjust the game so that that 5 foot tall basketball player has the same amount of scoring as the 6'9" basketball player. So I assume that what you do is when the 5 foot tall basketball player takes a shot, you're lowering the goal and then raising it when the 6'9" basketball player takes a shot. Obviously, that would be the death of basketball as we know it. But the point I'm trying to make is life is not based on equity. We all have different talents. Maybe I can get on the air and talk for an hour, whereas other people might not be able to do that. And maybe what I say makes sense to some, maybe it doesn't make sense to others. But there's no guarantee of success or failure. It is what it is. But when equity is pursued, what the problem with that is this: you don't allow for achievement, you don't allow for excellence, and what you end up with is a managed society where no one succeeds and no one fails unless they do so with the permission of their government. And we're getting closer to why this is taking place. You see, there was a time when, a long time ago, when Democrats were the party of slavery and Republicans were the party of the end of slavery. The Republican and Democratic Party prior to the Civil War, those differences were simply that. Democrats wanted to preserve slavery as an institution. Republicans wanted to emancipate the black man and end slavery. As the decades went forward, some differences came up. For instance, it became that the Democratic Party were supporting organized labor, and the Republican Party was against organized labor. And these things ebb and flow with the course of history. In my lifetime, I saw a Democratic Party who was moving closer and closer towards socialism. Government provided everything: jobs, income, benefits, health care. That the government would provide all of these things, whereas the Republican Party was for limited government, basic freedoms, and get out of the way and let business succeed through adventure capitalism, through entrepreneurship. In other words, I've got an idea, I'm going to make a go of it, and with hard work and determination and a good idea, all those things plus luck, I could become a millionaire. But when you stack the deck that only certain people are allowed to benefit, that only certain people can realize their potential, you've done two things. First of all, you've given a false sense of accomplishment to those who were given the benefits of this society through no work of their own, just by virtue of their identity group. And the other thing you do is you stymie the hopes and dreams of those who won't benefit from such a system. If, for instance, let's say that they decided there weren't enough people under 5 feet tall in the medical profession, and they started making laws that established firm quota that only certain people who are under 5 feet tall can be medical professionals. Not only would that be unjust, that would be insane, because what we'd find out with, there are far fewer people in medical profession than we need to survive as a society. Now, that's an extreme example, but that's what happens when you start labeling people and rigging the system to benefit some over the others. It's inevitable. It's going to happen, and it's going to create resentment. A lot of what Barack Obama left us as the result of his presidency is a renewal of people thinking in terms of race in ways they haven't done in 3 or 4 decades. It has set us back to the point where we're being pushed apart, whether by segregated graduation ceremonies like we see at Columbia University, or in critical race theory that's being thrust upon those students who are so young they don't understand the agenda behind it. All they get is the message, and the message is this: if you're white, you need to constantly apologize for what happened in the past and be willing to accept whatever corrective actions are necessary to achieve equity. I feel sorry for both black students and white students, because white students are going to be taught to be ashamed of who they are just based on their race. And black students are going to be given the success, earned or not, that's just going to come as a result of critical race theory and equity desires. In other words, where's the accomplishment there? If it's impossible for a white student to get an A, and it's impossible for a black student to get an F, and these are extremes, neither student can be really assured that the grade they got was what they earned. And therein lies the problem. If you take away initiative, if you take away that work ethic that made this country great, and you replace it with a system based on guaranteed outcome, essentially what you've done is cut off your nose to spite your face. I can show you, for example, the benefits of private enterprise versus government from the simple history, most recently, of the development of vaccines. These vaccines weren't developed by the National Institute of Health. These vaccines weren't developed by the Centers for Disease Control. These vaccines were developed by private industry with one caveat, that the COVID virus was so deadly and dangerous, get all of the government out of the way and let the wheels of private industry come up with a solution. Not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, but 5 different private companies came up with the solution once President Trump got the government out of the way. Had he not done so, had he not pre-ordered 800 million doses across these different manufacturers up front, we wouldn't be inoculating people today. There would be no vaccine, none, because it would have gotten caught up in the sluggishness and sloth of our government oversight. That's why these prescriptions were developed so quickly. That's why we're able to give out these vaccines at the rate we're doing. Because Donald Trump told the government, get out of the way and let this thing happen. We need it quickly, and it happened. And it's a simple thing. So while President Biden tries to take credit for everything related to these vaccines, he knows no more about distributing vaccines than he does about ballet. But he has the media on his side, doesn't he? You know, I'm reminded of a family member. She has a master's degree, and she believes every word Biden says because she's told to. In other words, there's 3 kinds of ignorance. There's ignorance from those who just don't know. And that's not something against them. They just don't know something. I don't know the different moves in basketball or ballet. I'm ignorant of those strategies. If you put me on a basketball court, even when I was a youth and in shape, I was a clumsy ox running into all the different players. It wasn't my game. But when you have a system where people are told they cannot succeed without the assistance of government, you've created a permanent dependent class. And with a permanent dependent class, you've also created the genesis of a dependent society that cannot function without the aegis and the incentive of government. And that is not what made this country great. In fact, every time that ideology has been put into practice, entire countries, have failed and failed miserably. Blood has been ended up spilling. Look no further than Venezuela. 30 years ago, Venezuela was the wealthiest country in South America. They were the wealthiest country in the Western Hemisphere except for the United States. And now, Venezuela, as the result of the Maduro regime, as the result of the Chavez regime, which was pushing communism on a free society, their economy is the worst in the Western Hemisphere. It's very simple. Socialism doesn't work for the simple reason that it flies in the face of human nature. If I guarantee you a home, food, medical care, and limited luxuries, you have no reason to want or need to work. Take that and spread it across a country, and you've got a failed economy because there are no inventors or innovators. All you have is people waiting for the check to come from the government. That is not what this country was based on. That is not how this country became the strongest in the world. But that is, taking that away is what will destroy this country. And it's happening right before our eyes. We're seeing it all over because the Biden administration is signing executive order after executive order that are outside the authority of the Constitution, but nobody's stopping them. The court's not stopping them. The Supreme Court isn't getting in the way. And the Constitution is only as good as our courts enforce the terms of that Constitution to be. How can we have a workable government if we don't stick to the basic tenets of representative democracy? The answer is we can't. Today, the People's Republic of China, who had no navy to speak of 50 years ago, now has the strongest and largest and most powerful navy in the entire world. And this doesn't just hurt people here in Hampton Roads, many of whom depend on the United States Navy and other branches of the military for their livelihood. Oh no. This affects all of us because we are less safe. You know, up until World War II, the United Kingdom, Great Britain, had the world's most powerful navy. But as the war approached, they found themselves under-equipped, and we basically gave them a lease on 50 overage destroyers to bulk up their navy so they could fight a war against Nazi Germany. It worked. Between the United States and Britain, we defeated Nazi Germany on the high seas. Their navy was basically submarine-based. But in the wake of that war, Britain lost its #1 position as the world's most powerful navy, and that became the domain of the United States. And for many, many, many years and decades, the United States Navy was the most powerful navy in the world. But that's not the case anymore. Because while we've been arguing over the socialized implications of having a navy that's not based on merit, but based on identity group, and that's taking place now across the services thanks to the Biden administration, what we're left with is a #2 spot. And don't think for a minute that a powerful China is going to be ambivalent towards the United States. Oh no. They're building up their Navy and their military forces because they seek to dominate the world in every single aspect, whether that's financial, whether that's in terms of trade, whether that's in terms of military power. They're out to dominate the world. And they don't care about luxuries such as individual rights and individual freedom. Their people have none. In fact, what they're doing against the Uyghur Muslims in China amounts to the same final solution that Hitler had in dealing with the Jews. That's right. We have a Holocaust going on in China where Muslims, Uyghur Muslims, are being put in concentration camps. They're being abused. They're being sexually assaulted. And what is the United States doing about that? Well, the closest Biden got to communicating with the Chinese was having his son walk away with $1.5 billion in cash once he was out of office. Do you really think he's going to take issue with the Chinese since they basically financed his presidential campaign? I don't think so. So what do we have? We've got an aggressive ascendant China putting a virus across the face of the world that has ended in millions of deaths, and there's no one that's going to hold them to account because Biden is owned by the Chinese, our president. And if you don't think that's a problem, then somebody needs to take a hot pot of coffee and pour it on your head because you are asleep to reality. And I don't mean to take this kind of tone, but this country better wake up on the quick, or this country is not going to be a country anybody wants to live in anymore. You know, Nora Firestone and I have had several conversations about why don't people just move places where they find themselves in compatibility with their neighbors. Well, and the obvious problem with that is if you're living in New England and you happen to be conservative, how are you going to just pick up everything and say move to Florida? Well, some people are actually doing that. And the countries that are run by leftist governors are losing population. California, New York. The countries that are run by Republican administrations are gaining population. Florida, Texas. That is not sustainable if a state wants to have any kind of economic prosperity. Because if you're losing people, you're losing taxpayers. And if you're losing taxpayers, that stymies your ability to run a state. But here's the very weird result of this COVID lockdown. These blue states some of them are actually seeing budget surpluses. How is that possible? Because providing services is something they haven't done, and therefore they haven't had the expenditures, but they're still getting the tax receipts. In other words, they're basically effectively promoting taxation without representation. That's why we had an American Revolution, because we wouldn't tolerate that from Britain. Yet how many of us in this country are allowing the ability to tax and spend our money that we earn, and we're not even willing to stand up and oppose those measures? It's no wonder that the leftists and the socialists are exacting their revenge upon capitalism, exacting their revenge on certain people based upon their racial or sexual identity. It's no wonder they're allowed to get away with this because, let's face it, nobody's stopping them. The courts aren't stopping them. The Republicans, the ones who have the guts to speak up, and that aren't many, they aren't many, they're not stopping them. So what's to stop H.R. 1 from becoming law, where all ballots will be mailed out and mailed back in without any verification that the person casting the ballot is the person to whom the ballot is assigned. They're doing away with voter identification on a wholesale basis. Why? Because the winner of an election is the one who has the best Xerox machines in place. That's not representative democracy. That is a fraud. We saw it firsthand in the presidential election. How could all of these Republicans be taking away Democrat seats and Biden win? It doesn't make any sense. Of course it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense that Biden received 20 million more African American votes than Obama did back in the last time he ran. It isn't that there's so many more black Americans voting. The fact of the matter is, Donald Trump set a record in black American voters voting for him. So how was it that Biden still got 20 more million than Barack Obama did? The answer is he didn't. It was made up. It was fabricated. And if you don't think that the election of 2020 on the presidential election was a sham, then again, someone who not only needs a cup of coffee, they need it poured on their head because they're not seeing reality. Now, we're talking about one election. But if you institutionalize the fraud that took place in the 2020 election and put that in place from the federal government, not only is it anti-constitutional, but you've guaranteed one-party rule in perpetuity. If H.R. 1 becomes the law of the land, no Republican will ever win another presidential election, and no Republican will ever be a majority leader in the Senate or a Speaker of the House, because the system will have been rigged that only Democrats can win. That, ladies and gentlemen, is how a country's government gets stolen from them, gets ripped away. And if you think that this country is better off being run by Speaker Pelosi and being run by Majority Leader Schumer and being rubber stamped by a complete idiot in the White House named Joe Biden, then basically what you're advocating is the destruction of the country. So you see, it's not only conservative liberal anymore, Democrat Republican anymore. It's not only capitalist versus socialist anymore. Those politicians who seek to destroy this country are nothing short of evil. It's good and evil. That's what it's come down to. You either want a strong America or you don't. And on the idea that America is based on certain freedoms, the freedom of religion, the freedom of the press, the freedom of expression, the freedom of assembly, the right to bear arms. If none of those things mean anything to you and you don't think we should have those rights, then you not only are anti-American, you hate America. And if you hate a system of government based on individual freedom, individual liberty, then you are by definition evil. Evil incarnate. And that's who's running the powers to be in Washington today. They're evil. You see, Jen Psaki can get on the air and lie through her teeth, and she knows she's lying because she has an agenda, and the agenda is the destruction of this country. And so is Kamala Harris under that same agenda. And all of the leftists running the United States government, and they're running us into the ground. They're erasing our borders. They're erasing our laws. They're erasing our sense of safety and security, and they're replacing it with an evil leftist ideology bent on the destruction of this country, and that's what makes them evil. That's what makes it evil. So if you're listening today in Hampton Roads and you care about this country, make sure you let your elected leaders know they don't have your support when they act like this. Call up Elaine Luria and tell her you are livid at what she has done in terms of her impeachment votes based on nothing more than false claims. Her vote to support a $1.9 trillion so-called COVID relief package that has nothing to do with COVID in the main. Only 9% of it does, and everything to do with a power grab and rewarding Democrats for their pet projects. This area, which depends so much on the military, is willing to elect any Democrat as long as they're ex-military. Whether or not what they want is going to be good for the military or bad, that's beside the point. As long as they're ex-Navy, they get elected. Good, bad, or blasé. Well, that has to change. People have to start digging into the issues on their own, and they can't rely on the media to tell them the truth. We already know the media is a cooked goose. So what do we need to do? We need to get off of our duffs, look into things, find out the real implications of what's going on, and make our voices heard. Because if we don't make our voices heard today, tomorrow we will not have the right to make them heard. And then what do we got? We got what leftists and socialists want. A socialist dictatorship where the government determines winners and losers. Look at the way you register in this state for COVID vaccinations. I'm morbidly obese. I have diabetes and severe neuropathy as a result of the diabetes. I registered a month ago for my vaccines. I haven't heard squat other than confirm your information, and they send a link that's broken. But I'm no closer to getting a vaccine for COVID than I would be getting a vaccine for malaria. And those, there is no vaccine for malaria. Why? And why are teachers in this state and inmates in this state given the vaccine before regular citizens? Why? Because they want to determine who wins and who loses. We cannot have a country based on this. We cannot have a country guaranteeing individual freedom when we determine who's entitled to that freedom and who isn't. And that's the problem. Take away my rights today, they'll come after yours tomorrow. And then what do we got? If you have enjoyed today's show, I want you to take time to call the station WKQA Freedom 1110 and let them know your feelings. Also, call them if you think that I'm, got no business on the air and you think I'm a nutcase. Give them some feedback, but make your voices heard. That's what it comes down to. I don't give a hoot in hell whether you agree with me 100% or disagree with everything I say. I do believe, however, in your right to voice your opinions. Because if I cannot guarantee that I'm 100% behind your freedom of expression, then you'll never guarantee that I have the same rights in reverse. And that's where freedom fails. This country is very, very unique in that we have on paper guarantees of freedoms and individual initiatives. And we're guaranteed certain rights, not based on what government gives us, but what God gives us. As it says in the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. These are God-given rights endowed by our Creator. Those are the words. But leftists want to tear that down because they don't see as it's promoting a society based on guaranteed outcomes and equity. Is that what we want? Because if in that scenario, every National Football League team will end the season at 8-8. So how do you determine who goes to the Super Bowl? That's the problem with guaranteed outcomes. You can't have a society function if the outcome is based on anything other than individual achievement and hard work and good ideas. Do we really want to have a society where the government determines who is successful? The government determines what works and what doesn't? Because Many of us have lost our faith in the institutions that are the basis of this country: family, church, community. That's because the people in charge of the messaging has convinced us that those things are bad. Well, they're not bad. People are good regardless of their race. People want the same thing for their kids. But any real American doesn't want it to be handed to them like a free hamburger. They want the opportunity to be able to earn it and have the fruits of their labors benefit their family, their children, their spouses. How can we have a strong economy? How can we have a strong nation when our government is dead set on tearing it all down? And that's what's happening today. The Democrats are basically seeing how much damage they can do because they know that Americans are opposed to what they're doing, and they only have a short time to get their agendas done. And as long as that is the case, we don't stand a chance, because the media is not going to do their job to keep us informed. And everybody will be like my poor sister, who is only so willing to thank God for the honesty of Joe Biden because she doesn't know any better, and she doesn't want to know any better. It's one thing not to know, but if you don't even want to find out, you don't even want to dig to find out whether what you believe is correct or not, if you're not even willing to do that, you've already surrendered your freedoms to those people who don't want you to have the benefits of a free society. And how can we move forward ignoring all of the pluses of our historical past? Yeah, there were some things in history that were not so great, but by and large, this has been and continues to be the greatest country in the world. But that's not a guarantee. We got to preserve it. We got to do what we can to make sure the country we leave our children and grandchildren will be as strong as the one we left. And we're not going to do that given the agendas of too many in Washington who only seek to tear us down and tear us apart as a people. So think about that. Give it some thought. I know how you feel. I myself have been completely turned off of staying informed because the things I hear on the news I can't trust. But the minute I myself give up and stop talking about this, the other side's already won. They've already prevailed. There is no more argument because they won. Consider this. History dictates and has shown over and over again that freedoms lost today cannot be regained tomorrow without blood. So what do we want? Do we want it to get so bad that we're thrust into some ideological civil war where we're fighting each other? We're not the problem. It's the powers that be. It's the media. It's the politicians. It's the lawmakers. They're the problem, not us. They are the problem. And we are the solution. Politicians can't solve anything unless they have the spirit of truth and the support of the people behind them. They can only make matters worse, as history has shown again and again and again. It's not going to be enough anymore just to vote and pay taxes. That's our duties as a citizen. But we have to participate. We have to make our voices heard. We have to let the political leaders know, no, they cannot take our Constitution and run it through a virtual shredder where no rights are established and no rights are guaranteed. So as we enter this spring, let us all adopt a sense of renewal, a renewal of personal responsibility. Yes, it is your responsibility to make sure that your government is limited according to the basis of the Constitution. It's your responsibility to make sure that our leaders are enacting laws that benefit society rather than just hurt Americans. It's your responsibility to let your leaders know that you don't want an open, porous border. Do that, we have a chance of surviving. This is Drew Nickell sitting in for Nora Firestone, And on behalf of WKQA Freedom 1110, thank you for joining us today.